because the subject of my discussion today is why am I feeling more positive now about an Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, more than I felt before. And in order for me to tell you why I feel more positive now, after my trip in June of this year, I have to tell you about my trip 4.5 years ago when we went there to film the movie Surviving Peace. At that time, I met with Israelis and Palestinians on both sides. And I noticed that they both are very, very strongly in favor of a two-state solution. And the idea of creating a confederation was completely misunderstood and completely unacceptable once it became understood. But I got strong, very strong resistance 4.5 years ago from both sides. One of the things that I'd like to tell you about, it's a small thing, because this lady asked me 4.5 years ago, she said, why would you even need a confederation? What would a third secular, independent, mutual government for the Israelis and the Palestinians, what good would it do that she happened to be Israeli? What good could that government do that the Israeli government could not? Why do we need this trouble of creating another system? And in order to understand what the significance of what I told her, you have to understand one of the objections that mostly come from Israelis is they say, we will only be able to make peace with the Palestinians when they stop teaching their children to hate Israelis. As long as they continue to teach their children to hate Israelis, and they are born that way and they grow up that way, we'll never be able to make peace. So I had that in mind, and my response to her was, an Israeli-Palestinian Confederation will be able to pass legislation that neither the Israeli government nor the Palestinian government could oppose, could veto. And that legislation is to require the Israeli and the Palestinian educational system and public education system, like television, to teach tolerance starting with their children, to teach tolerance towards each other, to require that the Israeli schools will allow Palestinian professors or teachers to come over to Israeli school and teach Israelis about Palestinians, about the history of the Palestinians, and to require the Palestinian schools to allow Israeli teachers to come over to Palestinian school and teach them about the Israeli history. Now, no government can veto such a thing because they always said it starts with education. So here is a legislation that the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, that no government will be able to veto such legislation. And I purposely started with that legislation, although there could be many, many legislation. And remember, I don't know if all of you know, but the gist of the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation is that once it passes legislation, it will allow the Israeli parliament, the Israeli government, the Palestinian parliament to veto the legislation. So the question is, what kind of legislation will they be able to pass that neither side will be able to, would want to legislate, would be embarrassed to legislate? And that's a good example. So when I told her that example, her response was, oh, want to make peace by being nice to old ladies. Meaning, you want to make peace by being nice, by being positive. And she sincerely accepted what she just said. And I thought about what she was saying, and it occurred to me that their thinking, when I say their, I mean Israelis and Palestinians, their thinking is that before there is peace, there has to be a war. And there has to be a victory. And there has to be either annihilation of the other side, or the other side has to call uncle before there is peace. And that's really the gist of what she was saying. And I thought about it. And I thought, what would be a proper response to this? And it occurred to me, I happen to go to the gym a lot, and I noticed all the people that I spoke with at the gym, none of them had a heart attack before. But they're all going to the gym. One of the reasons they're going is to prevent a heart attack. In other words, you don't need something horrible to happen to you in order to take care of yourself. You can anticipate, based on information, that you need to take care of yourself. You need to exercise. You need to eat well. You need to exercise. And the idea that we first need to kill each other before we make peace is just a primitive, old idea. It shouldn't be part of our discussion today. And this time, when I went there and I happened to meet with her again, and I mentioned that to her. I said, you remember you told me that? And she did not acknowledge, but it doesn't make a difference. But this time I noticed a more substantive discussion. It's no longer, because I met with Israelis and Palestinians, they always told me how their sons and daughters are serving in the military, in the best units, the units that saved the state of Israel. And it occurred to me, our grandparents on both the Israeli and the Palestinian side fought the war. Our parents fought the war. We fought the war. Our children fighting the war. And guess what? Now our grandchildren. And to be proud of that just does not make sense. What about peace? What is your plan for peace? It's not enough to show that your country is doing economically well, that you have the best internet system, that beautiful freeways and beautiful high-rise buildings where people drive into their, that hasn't occurred 30 or 40 years ago in Israel. It's amazing. And also in some part of the West Bank and also some part of Gaza. Amazing apartment buildings with beautiful parking lots, view, with all the amenities you can think of. You use your telephone to turn the elevator. So people are inspired by the economic success. And they pay for it with lack of peace. So they accept the fact that there is no peace. That's part of life. And for that, we are getting huge economic success. And to them, that's enough. To the people I spoke with. The idea of making peace is completely alien. It's completely strange. It's not even discussed. The governments of Israel and Palestine, they never promise peace anymore. They don't even talk about peace. peace is almost a strange word. It's not being used anymore. Not to mention that they don't have a peace plan, that they don't publish any peace plan. They only have war plans with each other. But this time when I went there, I noticed a little discussion, a little difference. I noticed that I'm being asked more substantive questions. And I would say I was given more objections. But the objections to me were positive because it was a substantive discussion. They wanted to know more because they realized that their children are also going to go to war, and their grandchildren. And they realized that, you know, some of the people I met with, Israelis and Palestinians, they live 4 kilometers from each other. Sometimes half a kilometer, sometimes 50 feet from each other. And they don't know each other. There's a wall between them. In a lot of areas, imagine, we live in Irvine. What's the next city? The 405 freeway. Past the 405 freeway. What's the next city past? Tustin. So imagine that in order to go from here to Tustin, you need to go to Santa Monica first, go around, and then come back to Tustin to visit your grandmother. Simply does not make sense. And then you need to present a passport, and you need to have a permit. Just simply does not make sense. So they do realize that it doesn't make sense. So I would like to talk to you about some of the objections that I received that mostly I'm going to be talking about, because this time I was mostly in Israel, only in Israel. I did not go to the West Bank or Gaza, but I'm planning to go there again in November, and I'll visit more areas. So this time I got more objections. But it was substantive. It was, to me, it was encouraging because there was a discussion. So the first objection was, you know, we are different culture. And different cultures, they cannot live together. We're a different culture. And when you think about it, you say, okay, what is the difference? Most people who live in Israel and Palestine are of Arab ancestry. Jews and Muslim and Christians. 60% of the Israelis who live in Israel and Palestine are from Arab origins. They came from Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and many other Muslim countries. They mostly speak, when they came, they mostly spoke Arabic. My parents spoke Arabic. My grandparents, my mother hardly spoke Hebrew. My dad spoke good Hebrew and good English, but my mother hardly spoke Hebrew. All my uncles and aunts and all the Iraqi community that I came from, between them, they spoke Arabic. They used to listen to Arabic music. They loved Arabic music. I remember my mom and my dad were dancing in the kitchen to Arabic music, and I was embarrassed. I didn't want my neighbors to hear it. What, are we Arabs? And my dad, his name was Salim. But you wouldn't know that that's his name. His name was really Abu Abraham. Abu Abraham is a name that is given to, in the Arab culture, to a man who has a son. Just like Abu Mazen. Abu Mazen, that's not his name. His son's name is Mazen, and he's honorably called Abu Mazen. All my uncles, Abu Silman, Abu Eliyahu, Abu Sasson, everyone was known as Abu. They all spoke Arabic. So, where is the cultural difference? The Palestinians that are in Israel, also from Arab area, they have more in common between themselves than you would think is even possible. Most Jews that came to Israel and Palestine before 1948 and after 1948 came from totalitarian countries. They didn't come from a democracy, from Russia, from all the Arab countries, from Germany, from Poland. They were all totalitarian countries. They did not vote. And that brings me to the next objection that I heard. Fine, you want to create a democracy with Israelis and Palestinians. The problem is that Muslims have no tradition of democracy. That's what they claim. They say, look at what's happening in Syria. They're just killing each other. See, the idea is, and it's very, very prominent in Israel, that Muslims, because of Islam, are incapable of being democratic. That Islam, by its nature, is anti-democratic, and it's violent. So why would we Israelis, that's the objection, want to be in a democracy with people that are by nature aggressive, by nature fight all the time? But if you think about it, China is not Islamic and it's not democratic. The Jews, the Bible is not democratic either. It talks about kings, about prophets. There isn't a word, the word democracy never came up. Israel became semi-democratic after 1948, and it included everyone, Jews and non-Jews. And if you think about it, the Israeli Arabs have accepted democracy in the exact same way as all the Jews. Not only in the exact same way, even more so. They accepted a Jewish democracy, which is, for them, it's a humiliating democracy. They have to imagine any Jewish person would be willing to participate in an Islamic democracy. 2 million Arab Israelis are part of a Jewish democracy. They pledge allegiance when they are elected to the state of Israel, and they are voting in the same percentage as Israeli Jews. So the idea that Muslims do not have a tradition of Islam is just basically an argument to be made not to include democracy with Israelis and Palestinians together. There is no reason. And if you think about it, the people that are really fighting for democracy at this time in the world are in the Arab nations. The people in Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, Syria, they are dying for democracy. They are fighting. They are trying to change the system. How could you claim that they are not democratic? They are actually fighting for democracy. And then came the next objection is, yeah, but I don't trust them. And that objection came from both Israelis and Palestinians. I don't trust them. I don't want to be with them. So let's deal with that. Of course you don't trust them. They're your enemies. Enemies don't trust each other. Enemies are there to trick each other, to lie to each other, to fight each other, and you basically fight by not being honest with each other. The idea is to create a system that requires you to sit day in, day out, and come up with a system where you don't need to just personally trust. You create a system where everyone needs to participate. The way I like to explain it is, I hold the wheel, but you sit next to me. And if I do something wrong, you have the right to stop the car. You're able to stop the car. You create a system where you work together. And it's been proven in Israel in itself that Jews and Muslims can work together in a democracy. So why not expand the democracy into the West Bank and Gaza? And if you think about it, not only it makes no difference if you trust them or not, you need to make an effort to trust them, because especially for the Israelis, the Palestinians, because a lot of Israelis tell me, why do we need the Palestinians? Let the Palestinian make a confederation with Jordan or with Egypt. Why do we need to be with them? We want to be by ourselves. But what they fail to understand is that the Palestinians are an asset. They're not your enemy, they are your asset. Because the only people who can give peace to Israel are the Palestinians. If Israel does not make peace with the Palestinians, it's going to remain in a war with the Palestinians, and it's going to remain in a war with the entire region. So the only way that you can buy your peace is if you make peace with the Palestinians. And the least capable entities in that area, the least capable are the Israeli government, the Palestinian government, and Hamas. Those three entities are the least capable of making peace. So for us to look at them and say, after 70 years of them failing to make peace, please make peace for us, when they are really perpetuating the war. They are benefiting from the war. For us to go to those entities and say, make peace, defy logics. There has to be a democracy, a secular democracy for the people of Israel and Palestine together. It has to be secular, and it has to be independent of the Israeli government, has to be independent of the Palestinian government, has to be independent of Hamas. It has to come from the people. And there are enough logical, reasonable Israelis and Palestinians that are not nationalistic, or less so, that understand that they don't want to send their children again and again to be killed for something that has no solution. And in my opinion, there are about 10 to 20, maybe even 40% Israelis and Palestinians who are reasonable, who will be willing to participate in this kind of election for a confederation. And that would probably mean 2, 3, maybe 4 million people out of the 14 million people together. No Israeli, no Palestinian government will be able to stand against such power because they don't have legitimacy. The Israeli and the Palestinian governments have no legitimacy to oppose a reasonable solution for democracy and for peace. And peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians is just the tip of the iceberg. this peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians is the easiest thing to accomplish. Why? Because there are only really two issues that need to be resolved. The first issue is the refugees, the Palestinian refugees. The second issue is the occupation. Neither the Israeli nor the Palestinian governments are even able to touch those issues. They're not able to touch them. Those are the issues that are at the core of the conflict, and they're not able to touch it. An Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, a mutual government for the Israelis and Palestinian government, they don't have that nationalism agenda. They can deal with the Palestinian refugees, and they can deal with the occupation very, very easily. And it's not going to cost much money. In fact, it's going to save billions of dollars for both the Israelis and the Palestinians, not to mention blood of unlimited future. So the last question that I've been asked is, what's the benefit of an Israeli-Palestinian Confederation? Why do we need that? And the response to that is the benefit of a democracy. See, Israeli-Palestinian Confederation has a global vision, has a global outlook, not only on Israel, not only on Palestine, but the entire area. Now imagine how much power would a confederation government have to increase the value, to increase the life of the Israelis and the Palestinians if it was a government for both people. It would be able to connect with Iran, with all the Arab countries, with Europe, with America, all on a democratic value, not on a nationalistic value, not on a religious value, but on a value of democracy. So they are so engaged in this war between them that they're failing to see the possibility, the tremendous possibility that they could have working together. In Hebrew there is a statement, it says, Tovim hashnayim min echad. The two of us are much better than us fighting each other. So if you are good at public relations and organization, and I am good at other aspects, if we both work together, we can accomplish a lot more together than you and I fighting each other. Tovim hashnayim min echad. So I want to open to some questions, because I know speeches are boring, and I think that by answering questions, the issues will be clarified. Yes, ma'am.
So when you say confederation, are you talking about a one-state solution, or are you talking about the West Bank and Gaza ruling themselves without it? I'm trying, give me a little bit more about what you're envisioning.
What I am envisioning is a democracy for the people in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. A third independent government. I'm not envisioning anything about land. The Israeli government remains the same with all its institutions. If you're an Israeli citizen, your government is the Israeli government. You need to obey your government, all the institutions remain. The same with the Palestinians. But in addition to that, there will be a third independent government made out of Israelis and Palestinians together for the sole purpose of making peace and for the sole purpose of the prosperity of the people of Israel and Palestine.
But are you suggesting that the checkpoints go in the West Bank? Like, in other words, Israel does not occupy any of Palestine, or What are you suggesting as a solution?
What I am suggesting is that there will be a parliament made out of Israelis and Palestinians together. See, they don't have to envision the solution the way we've been trained in 70 years, that it has to be dividing land, that it has to be based on land, that it has to be based on borders. You could come up with ideas for democracy and peace and neglect, allow them, those two governments, to deal with each other the way they do, but you can come up with another system. That system is not based on land, it's based on people. It's a democracy for the people. And it would pass legislation, and it will require the Israeli, and it will allow the Israeli and the Palestinian government to veto the legislation.
Oh, so then they start with that and then let all that stuff take care of itself, like the checkpoints.
They can deal with the checkpoints,
Yeah,
they
let
can
it all
deal with
be
holy
dealt with.
sites,
But
they
that's
can
stuff-
deal with Iran, they can deal with, they can deal with whatever they want to deal in the way they see fit.
So that's like the start, that's the starting,
The starting point is to create the system.
the system, and
Yeah.
then let all that stuff happen,
Right.
but in a way that,
Cooperative, working together in a democracy.
got it, got it.
Yes.
And, sorry, but I have to leave, but would they be meeting in Jerusalem?
Okay. The question is, where would they be meeting, correct? The geography of where would they be meeting is meaningless. They don't have to meet in a geographical area. They don't have to meet at all. They could have all their discussions online.
Virtually?
They don't need to have a building if they choose. They can live, that's not important where they meet. It's important what they decide, how the discussions, that they will be transparent and that people will be able to see. So if you live in area number 38, you want to know what your parliament member, who happened to be either Israeli or Palestinian, what's his position on this particular issue. And you can read it online. They don't have, I mean, you probably live here and you have a congressman. You don't know what this congressman's position on any issue. You hardly go to Washington, D.C. But if you can see his discussion online, you'll be much more educated. So they don't have to meet in Jerusalem, they don't have to meet anywhere. But they could, whatever they decide. Yes?
I have a question. You say that there's the Israeli government and the Palestinian government and then the central unit. So let's say,
I didn't say center unit.
no, or democratic,
I said independent,
Independent.
secular,
yeah,
separate,
okay.
and mutual government for the Israelis and Palestinians together.
So let's say then that, Israel is being attacked by terrorists from Lebanon, and the Israeli government say, we would like to go and fight those people. Where is the decision being made? Can the central democratic coalition, can they stop it?
No, they cannot, they are not superior to either the Israeli or the Palestinian governments. They're not superior to them. They cannot veto those governments. Those governments can do whatever they decide to do. The Confederation is not like a federal government in the United States. It would be below those governments because it allows those two governments to veto their decision. But going back to your question, you asked me if Israel and Lebanon
Yeah.
decide. Right now, Israel and Lebanon do not have relations. The only language they have between them is war. They don't have any other language. So imagine you have the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation made out of Israelis and Palestinians. And if there is war between Israel and Lebanon, guess who is going to be hurt as well? Israelis and Palestinians. So it's in the interest of the Israelis and the Palestinians together in the confederation to go to Lebanon as a separate entity and say, hey, why don't we try to come up with a peace plan so we do not have to go to war, we do not have to fight each other. So it gives you an alternative that Israel right now does not have. Israel is now playing with, you're from Sweden,
Yeah.
you play soccer?
Yes.
How many players in a soccer game? 11?
11?
Would you want to go with 6?
No, not against 11.
Not against 11. Right now, Israel is going to war, is dealing with those issues with 6 players. There are 5 other players, Palestinians, that Israel is not able to use. Israeli-Palestinian Confederation will be using 11 players. Wouldn't that be much better? Yes. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Okay, Ruth.
I'm still a little confused as to where people will be living. Like, will the Israeli people stay on the West Bank? And will the Arab population stay in Israel? Or how will that work?
I don't know where they will be living because I am not the king of the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation. Okay? The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, 300 parliament members of parliament will sit and deal with every issue they choose. They may not choose to deal with that issue. They may not see that issue as a necessary issue. In my mind, they'll probably deal with issues about peace rather than about land. But they could. If you're a Palestinian parliament member from Jenin, you may decide to bring legislation to require the restrictions of Israelis from Jenin. You'll need to get 55% of the Palestinian members to vote yes on your legislation. You'll need 55% of the Israelis to vote yes on the legislation. Then you'll need to present it to the Israeli government and the Palestinian government and the Israeli Knesset and the Palestinian Knesset. And they may veto your legislation. So there are a lot of obstacles before you get to legislation. So I have no idea where it's going to happen. Yes, ma'am. Oh, yes, sorry.
You go first. You first. I'm trying to, if you can just kind of clarify, is this a theory? A theory, if they do this, if they do that, this will happen? Or is it something is like?
The excellent question. Is this about to happen, basically,
Yeah,
you're asking?
yeah.
Well, this idea has been propagated for the last 14 years. I wrote a book on that subject. There is a movie. There are people in Israel and Palestine. If you saw the movie Surviving Peace, did you see it?
No.
I may want to talk to you about showing it at your church. One of the parliament member in Israel, the one who negotiated peace, his name is Yossi Bailey, throughout the whole movie, objected to the idea, again and again and again and again. And then we found out 14 months after we met with him, he made a 180-degree change, and he said he thinks it's a very good solution. So, to answer your question, is it a theory? Yes, it is a theory. Is it going to become a reality? I'm hoping to get that Israelis and Palestinians will get together and say, well, you know what? We are tired of having the governments that have failed us for 7 years. We are tired, and we want to come up with another resolution. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, kind of.
Okay. All right. Yes.
I've got to show my ignorance here. I get the system. You have the Israeli government, the Palestinian government, you got a coalition in the middle. Or, I don't think the middle is the right place to put it, but coalition. Is the existing that part too.
That's a good question.
Yeah, okay. So your question is, for the audience, is there a Palestinian government at all that would be able to play part in this system? Okay.
Or is that part of the creation?
Yeah. All right. So that's a very good question. Just slight correction. It's not a coalition. It's a democracy. It's a government. It's a third independent government for the people of Israel and Palestine together. Now, under the Constitution, it has a Constitution. Under the Constitution, once the legislation of the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation is passed by the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation government, it would announce part of the legislation. Who has the veto power over the legislation?
No, that's not the question. Is there currently a Palestinian government substantial enough to participate, or is that part of what you're creating?
We are not creating the Palestinian government.
So there is,
Do
this
they
is what
have-
I'm done.
yeah.
The Palestinians have the PLO, and the Palestinians have Hamas. Hamas is in Gaza, and the PLO is in the West Bank. And they are in conflict with each other, but Hamas is the power in Gaza, the PLO is the power in the West Bank. Israel negotiates with the PLO.
Those are truly ruling organizations, as opposed to, are they seen as governments? Do they have the same status as the Israeli government?
No, they do not have the same status. The Israeli government is much, much more organized, much stronger, much more, basically the Israeli government control the PLO. It basically, and Hamas is in conflict with the Israeli government, okay? But going back, I know you don't care about that, what we do, the Confederation will recognize whoever it wants to recognize as the government. And it would say this legislation, because you see, some legislation may apply to only Gaza, would not apply to the West Bank. For instance, let's say you want to create a joint economic zone between Israel and Gaza. The Confederation may decide that the Hamas will be the only power that can veto the legislation, not the PLO, and the government of Israel. And they may decide that this legislation could, the only entities that could veto it will be Hamas and the Israeli government. It doesn't have to give the PLO because it's got nothing to do with the PLO. The PLO is in the West Bank. Why give the PLO in the West Bank the power to veto something over Gaza, over the economic well-being of the Gaza people?
Joseph, just for theory,
Yes.
so if this confederation does exist, technically Israel government can veto every single idea that the confederation comes up with.
Okay. So the question is, could the government of Israel veto every legislation? That's the question. And I would expand that by asking, could the Palestinian government veto legislation? Could Hamas veto every legislation? And remember, those governments all claim that they turn every stone for peace, that they will do whatever they can for peace, because they need the legitimacy of their people. The government of Israel needs the legitimacy of their people, Hamas needs the legitimacy of their people, and so is the PLO, because they need to have approval from their people. Once their people understand that there is a system for peace, And those governments would oppose reasonable legislation. Legislation that is approved by people from all over the world, that is approved by Palestinians, by Israelis. Those governments will not be able to veto the legislation because they will be embarrassed. They will lose their legitimacy. They cannot veto reasonable legislation. They wouldn't be able to.
Joseph, the balance of power, of course, is with the Israeli government right now. So I can't see, like, whatever the Confederation comes up with an idea, whatever it is, it's going to be helping one side or the other. If it helps the side that's already very strong, it makes no sense. So it's going to be helping the side that is weak. And the strong side is going to say no.
Well, your question is, the Palestinians are weak, the Israeli government is strong. How could you make peace between a weak government and a strong government? Correct?
Yes.
Okay. The answer is, we are creating democracy. A democracy based on people, not based on religion, not based on national origin, based on the people who live together. So the power, the legitimate power, will be with the Confederation because it focuses on democracy, on peace. Now, the Palestinian government, I agree with you, is not as strong as the Israeli government. But under this formula, it will have just as much strength as the Israeli government. Because they're both are given the same veto power as the Israeli and the Palestinian. They're both given the same veto power. The same here in the United States. You have a country like, what is a small state in this country? Rhode Island. It has 2 senators. And you have California with 36 million, 2 senators. So there is a system that allows for it to cooperate. How they do it? By congressmen. California has more congressmen. So you create a system that will allow for cooperation. And even though one side is not as strong, you give it enough incentive, both sides, California and Rhode Island, to work together. That's the system. You create a system. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
What about, it sounds like you have mainly Palestinian versus, or not versus, but and Israeli. So is there any provision for the government representing Arab Israelis and Druze and some of that, or do you have that kind of in your mind too, as part of this whole picture?
Okay, the question is there a way to distinguish, am I correct?
No, to represent
To represent
some other factions.
some
in this
other
whole
factions,
picture.
such as Druze, which are a minority in Israel, Cherkessim, which are minority, Christians that are minority, Muslims that are minority,
Arab Americans.
Arab Americans,
Arab Israelis, Arab Israelis.
LGBT, whatever. And the answer is, this is about a democracy. It's not about what your national origin is. It's not about your religion. It's a democracy. So you could be in district number 45 in the city of Beersheba, and your next door neighbor would be Muslim, Christian, Druze, whatever. And you would vote for the same person for that district because you like him, because he responds best to your wishes. So it's not about nationality. We're trying to get away with that. Not about religion, not about nationalities, it's about people.
Well, that, in other words, that it is not about that now, the way I see it. I mean, some people say it is, but I don't know. But so it would now be, is what you're saying. In other words, it wouldn't be where if you're Jewish, because you still have the Israeli government in place, that within Israel, if you're Jewish, you have certain, well, especially now with the Jewish state rule versus the Druze and.
The Israeli government is an entity. It has its laws. It has the laws of who it allows to be under its jurisdiction. The same with the Palestinians. But the Confederation encompasses everyone, regardless of whether they are Christians, Jews, Israelis, or Palestinians. It's based on local representation. You vote for a parliament member, and you vote for president and vice president. One will be Israeli, one will be Palestinian, and they will rotate every 2 years, regardless of their national. You're not going to be identifying yourself. There is no going to be anything on the ballot. Just vote for me because I am Christian, I'm Jew, I'm a Jewish, or whatever. That's not part of the formula.
But I guess I don't see how the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority can exist also and then have the Confederacy. I don't see which one overrides which, because there's some conflicts between them. So I don't see which one prevails if there's a conflict between the Israeli government, for example, and the Confederacy.
Well, there doesn't have to be someone prevailing. There are other areas of life that are not touched by the Israeli or the Palestinian government at all. Mainly the area of peace. So the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation will pass legislation for the sole purpose of making peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, regardless of their nationality. So you ask me, what example could you give me of them? You have to be practical here, not theoretical. Okay? So I'll give you, in this book, there are 29 examples of legislation that was actually passed by an Israeli-Palestinian mock government that we had on Facebook. Okay? So, but you have to, it's hard to envision it, but you have it here in the United States. You have your homeowner association, you have your city government, then you have your county government, then you have your state government, then you have your federal government. And they all are controlling different aspects of your life, just that you don't notice it. But you go from one jurisdiction to another depending on your activity, not depending on your geography. Yes, sir?
First of all, I wish you luck. I hope it can get started and maybe over time people will accept it. I don't know, but it looks like it's an idea. Hopefully we'll take it. But what you suggested earlier about education, that the children shouldn't be taught to hate.
Well,
Children don't need to be taught to hate. When you see people knock down somebody's house, they don't have to be taught that I don't hate. And this comes and takes their olive trees and invade and cast water and do all things. How are you going to say don't hate? Just love.
Right.
It's easy.
well, I may have been misunderstood. I did not suggest that children should be taught to hate.
No.
Just the opposite.
No, yes, but my question is, children don't have to be taught to hate. If you legislate in the schools, don't teach them to hate. Okay, we will not teach them. Children don't have to be taught. They see what's going on and they react to that.
I think children should be taught tolerance.
I understand that.
Okay, because children, they have to be shown that different people, they look different, they are maybe live differently, they're the same, that you should be making peace and you should be engaging with other children. You can't just think that it's going to happen on its own. You need to actually be engaged. You need to, Israeli children and Palestinian children, they are flown to America to engage with each other. That doesn't make sense. Why can't they drive 5, 10, 30 miles to engage with each other? Yes.
Speaking of education, have you seen or heard of the organization Hand in Hand?
Yes.
It educates Arab children and Israeli children in 8 schools throughout Israel, and they have Arab teachers and Jewish teachers. They learn each other's cultures and languages, and apparently it's very successful. They have waiting lists of families that want to participate in those schools.
Yes, but that's not enough. There has to be legislation to deal with the people of Israel and Palestine together. It cannot just be having few children meeting each other. There has to be a democracy. And there has to be a democracy based on, it has to be secular. It cannot be religious. And it has to be laws to require that both sides will behave economically, physically, with each other in a civilized way. It's not enough to bring few children under one organization. The organization is wonderful, I agree. There is another organization, many organizations, but they are not enough to make peace. And in order to make peace, you need a democracy. And you need a democracy for everyone. And you do not need to teach people that they are different from each other. Because some of them, most Israelis and most Palestinians are secular. They're not even religious. So what's the purpose of separating and fighting with each other? They're not even religious.
There's one hand up
Yes.
I think this is easier to understand how it works if we realize that those hateful acts are aberrations. They depend upon the inculcation of the idea that the other is not as human as we are. And teaching tolerance, something that would require the teaching of tolerance in schools, is not going to prevent the Israeli military from knocking down a house tomorrow. But it's going to start to cause a whole generation to question the values that they're being sent and the mixed messages they're being forced to try and somehow resolve within themselves about why it's justifiable to, shoot a child who's demonstrating.
Good point. That makes sense. Okay.
Well, let me ask you a question. Why would you be against a confederation? And the next question is, what is your plan for peace? And the answer is, you don't have an answer. You're just challenging, why would we not, how could this work, how could that work? But we've been going on for 70 years. At this point, you should be accepting this idea very readily. But the problem is that we are used to this idea that they need to be separated, that we need to make peace based on separation of land. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not going to make a question here, I'm going to make a statement, because in this forum, we've been making questions, we've been inquiring, which isn't about challenging, it's about inquiring to find out what you mean. And the statement that I need to make is, I think it's really awesome that you've thought up a government entity whose job it is to creatively engender peace. I think that's awesome.
Yeah,
And,
thank you.
I think also that the to find the places where you can push and move things. The other thing that I'm seeing in this is that this is very similar to desegregation in this country. You know, we sent sent children into, black children into a white school with armed guards at one point. Somebody said that tolerance in this country was helped vastly by desegregating the military in the Vietnam War era. The military coming home were changed because they relied on people of different races inside of military combat and learned to trust them. And so I see that the suggestions you're making are similar to that of starting to create a new generation with a new outlook and, you know, some possibility, and I think that's great.
So you're saying that the idea of a confederation is similar to desegregation in the United States?
I'm saying that the possible, if the Confederation, if its first act was to start looking at some desegregation of schools, either by teachers or curriculum, very similar, it's very similar.
Well, in that respect,
They did that.
yeah.
Yeah, and I realize that what they do isn't part of what you're planning. The structure and having a power that's able to say, let's do this thing that we think will help us, and we think it's too good for either side to say no to. And
Right.
I think it's very interesting.
But I think that what's unique about this idea is that people who are enemies and have been taught to be enemies, they could realize that they can come up with a body, a mutual body, which I call a confederation government, that would compete with their own governments. Because they realize that their own governments are not able to make peace, are perpetuating the war, and once they realize, and I think they do, they're very close to realization that they need to create a mutual body, that there is to come up with a legislation that would force their governments not to oppose it. And I think that's the unique aspect of this system. Yes, sir.
Me?
Yes.
This is probably not the best way to explain it. I can only do it because it's what's been on my mind recently. And that is, one of the questions that has bothered me is, it seems to me that the modern Israelis have no voice. Now, what it seems to me you're talking about is, and it's probably true on the side of the Palestinians, so I don't mean to be taking sides. It's just, that just has been in my brain. And so, it seems to me what you're saying is, give those people that don't seem to currently have a voice in their government, in this other government.
You say modern Israelis do not have a voice. Who did you refer to?
That's how it appears to me.
But who are the modern Israelis?
That aren't
The newcomers or the...
anybody that doesn't, take the Zionist approach of we want a war with everybody and.
Oh, I see.
whatever.
Okay.
They're obviously, in any organization, there are people that, think more in lines of peace and getting along with the other people. And so,
Well,
it seems to me that what you're talking about is giving those kinds of people a voice in a almost third government.
well, I don't know that look, Israelis and Palestinians, they are not monolithical in their thinking. Not all Israelis think the same way.
Right.
Not all Palestinians think the same way. And I found that a lot of Israelis happen to think like Palestinians, the same as Palestinians. because many of them are secular, and they are not into the idea of a religious state. Similarly, many ultra-Orthodox Jews and ultra-Orthodox Muslims, they also are similar in their thinking that God or religion should have much more say in society. But they are similar in their thinking. And Orthodox Jews and secular Jews don't think the same way. There are a lot of segments. There are LGBT community, a strong LGBT community in Israel, and now starting in Palestine. There are a lot of Israelis that are citizens of Israel, but they're not Jewish. There are a lot of Israelis that are Muslims. So I don't think that you can make a clear prediction of who will be in support of this. But I think that there's a real great number of reasonable Israelis and reasonable Palestinians. When this becomes more of a reality, they will vote for it. They will go for it. Because there are a lot of Israelis who just will be for it for their own economic or their own benefit. One benefit is not to be killed or not to send your children to war. That's a tremendous benefit. If your son or daughter is about to become into the military, you may want to look for a way for peace. It becomes more practical. Yes, Ruth?
Well, many of you probably know there is one village in Israel called
Neve Shalom.
Neve Shalom Wahat Al Salam. It's an intentional joint village of Jews and Palestinians, or Jews and Arabs, however you want to say it. The kids go to school together, they learn each other's language, they celebrate each other's holiday. And I'm wondering, do you see more of that occurring under the end of segregation, that there would be more joint villages of this type?
I don't.
You don't see that?
I don't see that happening right now. Right now, they're actually.
No, I mean, under your theory.
Well, look, I told you, I'm not the king of this. I don't know what's going to happen. I am just suggesting a system. Now, they may decide to have joint schools. It makes a lot of sense. But right now, without it, they are becoming even more polarized, the Israelis and the Palestinians. I mean, Neve Shalom is an exception.
I know.
Yes.
Yeah, recently, the Israeli Knesset passed a law
Yeah.
that,
The national
and,
Nation
yeah,
state.
national state law.
yeah,
Right.
which means that only Jews are. And I always wonder, why is it that after 70 years, and now they have peace with Egypt, with Jordan, and good connections to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and why they are moving more to the right? There is
For
no
political
agreement.
reasons.
Huh?
For political reasons. It's the government in control, for political reason, decides that it's, in order to maintain control within the system of the Israeli electorate system, they need to move to the right. Governments move to the right all the time for political reasons.
Like the US.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
gonna say, where are we?
Yeah, I mean, we see it all the time. It basically creates some sort of a conflict and strengthens them. But actually, I think it makes the idea of a confederation much more likely, because like I said, the people that are to the right, to the extreme right, who may not all, but it makes the conflict, it makes much more clear. It makes the idea that, it makes it clearer that the Israeli and the Palestinian governments are not able to make peace, because they are both moving to the right.
Do I understand that you envision, though, that both sides have to accept this coalition's existence?
No, they don't have to accept it.
It's not gonna be forced on them externally?
It's going to be part of the people of Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, that's what
The
I mean.
government of Israel and the Palestinians do not have to accept this. There is no requirement that they will accept this. It's going to be,
Well, I mean just their existence. I'm not talking about accepting what they pass as a law or something like that. I'm saying.
no, the acceptance of the Confederation is not required by the Israeli, or, in other words, the Israeli and the Palestinian governments do not have to accept an Israeli-Palestinian Confederation in order to create an Israeli-Palestinian Confederation. The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation could be created and should be created regardless of the government of Israel and regardless of the government of Palestine. Those governments are unable to make peace. Yes, ma'am.
Joseph, you've had this idea now for some time. Why hasn't it already been implemented?
That's a very good question. I mean, I'm basically one person, almost. There is an organization, but I'm one person. I'm involved most of the day with my work. I devote sometimes to this. There wasn't I put a full-page ad in the New York Times. Full-page ad in the New York Times. Not a single person, not a single journalist called up to ask what it is. We had a movie on the subject. There was very little review of this movie. And the reason is, people are, both the Israelis and the Palestinians, that's a very good question. They are afraid of peace. They are afraid that peace will change their identity. The Israelis have their identity, the Palestinians have their identity, and they mostly define their identity with animosity towards the other side. But they are afraid of peace. They don't want peace. Most Israelis and most Palestinians, they're afraid of it.
When you say most of the people are afraid, do you mean the political leaders, or say military or political leaders, or just, you know, grassroots people?
Across the board, in my opinion, Israelis and Palestinians, politicians and people in the street are afraid of peace. They much rather remain in war with each other because they know that a war will maintain their identity. And their identity now is made out of religion, nationalism, and militarism. All three combined on both sides. And what I say is that there are few reasonable Israelis and Palestinians that, even though they are very nationalistic, they understand that their governments is not able to make peace. And they understand that there has to be another solution. And despite their nationalism, despite their identity, they will support this.